I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Dame Siobhain McDonagh.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I stand to speak out of desperation on behalf of the 112,660 homeless families, 145,800 children and 20,000 babies who are currently living in temporary accommodation. I meet at least 3 or 4 of those families every single Friday at my advice surgery, as they are put in cramped, uninhabitable or overcrowded temporary accommodation. When I use the word temporary, I am being misleading, because homeless families are being placed in temporary accommodation for so much longer than anybody ever should. 3,700 families have lived in temporary accommodation for over 5 years. One family has lived in it since 2009. Some of their children spend their entire life living in so-called temporary accommodation.
Thank you so much. My honourable friend's making a very powerful speech already. I was informed by Shared Health about a family, a woman who had to flee her home because of domestic violence with her 3 children. She's been put into temporary accommodation, which is unfit for human habitation, and she's been told that it's likely she'll be there for 10 years. It's absolutely inexcusable, isn't it?
My honourable friend's story of that particular family is sadly not unusual. I do know of the work of Shared Life, who are part of the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for temporary accommodation, and I know what brilliant work they do, and I know that she will have a strong advocate in them in trying to resolve the difficulties that she is experiencing. I'd like to use my speech today to tell the House about a few of the families I know of and the disadvantages their children face at every stage of childhood, from pregnancy all the way up to A-levels.
For bringing this forward. When it comes to families in temporary accommodation, the Honourable Lady for Mitcham and Morden is right to bring this forward. I have similar people in my constituency who have the similar issues, and some sofa surf, and some have temporary accommodation, and some have been there for years. Does the Honourable Lady agree that there is much more need for social housing, more new build social housing? And this can only go hand in hand with funding and planning in local authorities. And I have to say, I believe it needs to be centralised. Does the Honourable Lady, when it looks to solutions, that's one of the solutions?
I would agree with the Honourable Member. Indeed, it is the only solution. The only way we're going to bring an end to the use of expensive and appalling temporary accommodation is through the building of more social housing units. And in my speech, after I've spoken about the consequences of temporary accommodation, I'd like to look at the cost to the taxpayer of that accommodation, the billions of pounds we're spending that, frankly, I could think such better uses for, and finally, the solution to this mess. The stories of dislocation and crisis could fill the debate alone. I've managed to get 2 or 3 of these cases resolved in the last week. These are a selection, and I could have doubled, tripled or quadrupled the example of the conditions that the people are being kept in, but I will start with just this one. Joanna. Joanna was placed in a shared house when she was 4 months pregnant, along with 4 men she did not know. Joanna had been living there for 14 months, and by the time she came to see me, she had a 9-month-old daughter. Like countless of other pregnant women and parents with small children, she worried endlessly for her safety. The biggest worry for people like Joanna is that they have no safe sleeping arrangements for their babies. That is important because we know that between April 2019 and March 2023, 55 children have died as a result of the temporary accommodation they were housed in. 42 of them were under 1. Their most likely cause of death is sudden infant death syndrome because of the lack of a safe sleeping provision such as cots. I'd like to think that I speak for the whole House when I say that this is unacceptable. After their children start going to primary schools, families in temporary accommodation face a whole new set of challenges. That is because at least 30,000 of these families were placed in a borough outside their home, taking their children out of school, their families away from their support networks, parents and adult children from jobs, and away from hospitals and GP surgeries that they might desperately need. Once we remove a desperate, vulnerable family from their home environment, there are consequences for their children in school attainment and attendance and all sorts of other things. The guidance code on dealing with homeless families suggests that a priority for local temporary accommodation should be given to children in their exam years. That is a great aspiration, but I know that it is not being realised on the ground because local authorities cannot find such accommodation, particularly for larger families. Most schools would be loath to take a child in year 11 or year 13 because they would be in the second year of their exams and curriculums would not match. Schools of all status are concerned about their performance. One child was moved homes 5 times in their first 5 weeks of their GCSE exams and was forced to rely on a charity who paid for his taxi to his first exam. On one day at the Civic Centre in my constituency, the only temporary accommodation that could be offered to families was in Telford, 170 miles away from their home borough, and that is not unique. How can someone possibly start putting their life back together when they're 170 miles away from the borough that they have been living in? It's a ludicrous situation, meaning that thousands of children turn up to school dirty, tired and underdeveloped, far from ready for their vital first year. Some will have grown up confined to a small room shared with the rest of their family, with no space to play, walk or socialise with other children. Others might live in mixed housing blocks alongside drug users, where their older siblings prefer to use a potty in the cupboard rather than queue in the corridor for a shared toilet. I'm happy to take the Minister to the temporary accommodation that many of the families that I represent have lived in. The Honourable Member can meet Mr and Mrs N, who have 5 children that are all under the age of 8. They were originally living in my local borough of Morden in south-west London, where they were made homeless. But they have been sent to every corner of London to find temporary accommodation. First to north-east London in Walthamstow, and then again to Ilford. Ms N is now living over 2 hours away from St George's Hospital, where she needs to go for her appointments, medications and scans. Her children are missing school because of the more than 2 hours they have to spend travelling on public transport every day. The Minister could also meet Mr and Mrs G, who were made homeless when they were living in Collier's Wood, also in my borough of Merton. They were moved to West Croydon, where their children had a 90-minute journey to school, and at the end of last year they were relocated to temporary housing in Tottenham, again miles away from where they could have called home for nearly 2 years. They had finally found a school where their children were happy and starting to be more social, confident and secure. I want to read to the House what their primary school had to say about one of their children. Alfie is currently in reception. He has settled in really well and has a strong friendship network. His attendance is extremely strong at 97% and amounts to only 2 absences due to illness. His punctuality is currently 100%. Alfie's confidence has grown, and we are very proud of his development. We look forward to seeing him progress at this school. Alfie's parents have relied on a strong network of parents to help them navigate through the daily aspects of school life. I would worry that the impact of moving school as well as a new home would be very upsetting for him. Sir Roger, this is one of the many consequences of our country's lack of investment in new social housing. I'm conscious of time, but I realise that I have benefited from the early closure of the previous debate.
Will my good friend give way?
Yeah.
Can I thank my good friend from Mitcham and Morden for giving way, and can I congratulate her on securing this important debate? Just on the issue of local authorities, my local authority of Stockport in January this year had 153 households in temporary accommodation. Sir Roger, this figure was 101 families in January 2022. The use of hotels in Stockport alone has cost Stockport Council £625,000 in the last financial year, diverting resources away from other much-needed support services during the cost of living crisis. Does my good friend from Mitcham and Morden agree that this government has failed families in temporary accommodation?
I would agree with my honourable friend that these families have failed, and they are failed by all of us unless we get action to build more social housing. For a child who spent, and the shocking thing is that the weaker you are, the less fight you have, the worse you get treated. So if you are a child with special needs, you can often find the ridiculous situation that the social services department of the same council as the housing department that places you outside your borough scraps your transport to school to your special school because your council has moved you out of your area. I mean, it's extraordinary that we make victims of those people who just cannot stand up for themselves. You would not believe the fortune taxpayers spend on this unacceptable accommodation that often you would not put your pet in. London boroughs spent 90 million every month on it. That is 40% more than they spent last year. Councils in England alone spend 1.74 billion on temporary accommodation every year. That is 10% more than the year before and 62% increase over 5 years, with some councils seriously risking bankruptcy because of the cost of temporary accommodation.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She is making a very powerful and moving speech, and she is undoubtedly a doughty champion for those in temporary accommodation, not only in her own constituency but up and down the country. The Secretary of State has expressed his regret over the number of children living in temporary accommodation, despite him being a member of the government benches throughout. And the figures, as outlined by the Honourable Lady, make for very grim reading indeed, and it is clear that we cannot go on like that. So will my honourable friend agree with me that any future Labour government will have to work at pace across all government departments rather than silos to get these numbers down, just like we did the last time we were in office?
Can I absolutely agree with my honourable friend? This needs to be a mission of the next Labour government to provide more social housing and to give more support to those families in temporary accommodation. It strikes me as extraordinary that we as a country would be spending 1.74 billion on temporary accommodation, knowing that it's not going to go down anytime soon. In Merton, we have one of the lowest numbers of families in temporary accommodation, standing at between 400 and 500 families. But that is 400% higher than it ever used to be. And with a ban on Section 21 evictions kicked again into the long grass, I have no doubt that I will continue to see more and more families turn up at my weekly advice surgeries who've been evicted out of their homes and forced into temporary accommodation. But we can solve this crisis. It just needs the political will. And I would argue that this is something we've been missing over the last 14 years. I don't know how anyone can say that building more social housing has been at the top of the government's priority list when we've had 15 housing ministers in 10 years, an average tenure of 9 months. I'm sure that the Housing Minister is very talented, and I know that she is sympathetic to our arguments and has helped the APPG on temporary accommodation greatly. But I think even she would find it difficult to struggle around this generational crisis in less than a year. I try not to take things personally in politics, but when a government treats housing as a political game, as another hot seat for the latest minister, only to be turfed out months later, it is difficult not to be angry. Never has this country needed a cross-party, long-term consensus about tackling our housing crisis more than it does now, and never has a government seemed so ill-equipped to that challenge. I appreciate I may be biased, but the Department for Housing and Levelling Up must be desperate for a Labour government just to give them some stability. And I bet a fair few of the 112,660 families living in temporary accommodation would like to see that too. So here is what we can do. There are 19,334 hectares of unbuilt greenbelt within a 10-minute walk of London train stations where there is enough space for 1 million new homes. That would be a very sensible start. Then we could look at dealing with land bankers. In 2019, the FTSE 100 housing building companies were sitting on land banks of more than 300,000 plots between them. That would be even more land that could be used for some of the families I've mentioned today. Finally, it feels like stating the obvious. We could bring back mandatory house building targets for local authorities. It is incredibly important to bring them back, and I'm glad that the Labour front bench has committed to doing just that. There is one party in this House refusing to build on the grey belt, removing housing targets and delaying on the ban of Section 21 evictions. They are not sat on this side of the House. I want to issue a plea to the government: build the homes my constituents deserve so we can end the vicious cycle of temporary accommodation. The situation is desperate, and I hope that they give it the political will it deserves.
Minister Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I would like to start by thanking the member for Mitcham and Morden, firstly for securing this important debate and also for raising such important issues. And I must say I was delighted to work with her and her APPG on the new Homelessness Code of Guidance for COTs in temporary accommodation, and I look forward to working with her on other matters. I know that the whole House will agree that every child, every family deserves a decent, safe, secure home, which firstly means making more good quality, affordable homes available to families and having an effective safety net to prevent homelessness before it occurs. We're delivering on this by increasing supply. In the Conservative Party manifesto, we committed to building 1 million homes in this Parliament, and we are on track to achieve that. And I know that the Honourable Lady is very genuine in her desire to see more housing starts. But I would simply say that in London, under the Labour Mayor of London, London has been the worst performing region for housing starts in 2022. We are delivering more affordable homes, nearly 700,000 since 2010, and scaling up the delivery through the £11.5 billion Affordable Homes Programme, which will provide thousands of new homes for rent and sale across the country. Sure.
In last year, Morden Council had 72 two-beds and 34 three-bedroom properties to offer its 10,000 families on the housing register. The situation is just so dire that it will not be long before a local authority goes bankrupt just on the back of temporary accommodation costs. Surely the government has to intervene and do something.
Yes, and I will go on to explain what the government is doing. One of our schemes is the Local Authority Housing Fund, where we have given £1.2 billion for local authorities so that they can build and purchase housing both for recent arrivals like Ukrainians and Afghans, but also for temporary accommodation. And I believe that the Honourable Lady's Borough of Merton was a beneficiary in round 2 of the LAF fund and received just under £750,000. But as I was saying, we have an affordable homes programme that is a massive £11.5 billion, which will provide thousands of new homes for rent and sale across the country. And also, as the Honourable Lady alluded to, quality of temporary accommodation is also very important. The number of non-decent homes has fallen by 2 million since 2010. What's more, from April, we restored the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile. This means that 1.6 million low-income households will be on average around £800 a year better off, making it more affordable for families on benefits to rent properties in the private sector. Sure.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I'm grateful for her mentioning the local housing allowance. Now, it has been operated. However, rents in Stockport are already some of the highest in Greater Manchester and North West, and local housing allowance is not sufficient enough in order to meet the market needs in Stockport. So will she revisit this and specifically look at the rates in Greater Manchester and North West, reflecting the need but also the average rates?
So the local housing allowance has been uprated to the 30th percentile, which means that you should be able to afford the bottom 30% of properties on that allowance. The intention is not that you can afford every property, but this falls under DWP, but there is an ongoing commitment to review the local housing allowance. Ultimately, we all want to avoid people facing homelessness in the first place, and we're putting almost £2.4 billion over 3 years towards tackling this, including £1.2 billion through the Homelessness Prevention Grant. Since the Homelessness Reduction Act came into force in 2018, more than 740,000 households have been prevented from losing their housing or supported into settled accommodation. The Act supports the most vulnerable, including providing temporary accommodation to pregnant women and victims of domestic abuse. We have come a long way, but I recognise that challenges remain and the impact that living in temporary accommodation is having on too many families. The Honourable Lady mentioned the data from the National Child Mortality Database. Clearly, this is incredibly concerning, and that is why we updated the Homelessness Code of Guidance this February to make it clear that temporary accommodation should not be considered suitable for a family with children under 2 years old if there is not enough space for a cot, and that housing authorities should support families to secure a cot where needed. Where families are placed in temporary accommodation, I share the ambition to improve housing quality across the board and to ensure that families know how to complain when they're being let down. This is the thinking behind the new proactive consumer regime being introduced via the Social Housing Regulation Act, which gives the regulator of social housing new tools to hold social landlords to account. The current review of the Decent Home Standard and measures in the Renters Reform Bill also aims to strengthen standards and regulation across all tenures, including temporary accommodation. The Honourable Lady mentioned the health and education impacts of living in temporary accommodation, and this is something that I really want to dig into deeper. I did have a conversation just last week with the Shared Health Foundation, whom I know the Honourable Lady spends time with, and we had a very productive conversation, and I can give the commitment that we will work across government departments to look at improving health and education impacts for those in temporary accommodation. We are committed to ensuring that all children, especially the most vulnerable in our society, are safe and have access to an excellent education. That is why we are providing over £2 billion in 2024 to 25 through the pupil premium to support disadvantaged pupils, which will include many who live in temporary accommodation. Concerns have been raised with me that children who are in temporary accommodation, and indeed adults also, may lose their place on NHS waiting lists if they move out of their ICB. I have been reassured by colleagues in the Department of Health and Social Care that that should not be the case. I know that that was a concern of the Shared Health Foundation, and I'm very happy to follow up with anyone with these concerns, but that should not be the case. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for raising these issues. None of us want to see large numbers of people in temporary accommodation. We want these numbers to fall, and that is why we have a series of government initiatives such as the Homelessness Prevention Grant, the Local Authority Housing Fund, the Local Housing Allowance Rate. It is clear that we need to address the drivers and impact of homelessness on children living in temporary accommodation, and that we all need to work collectively to get these numbers down and to do the best we can for the most vulnerable groups in our society.
The question is that this House to stand adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.